Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is where we take that uh, crushing volume of research you've collected, all the articles, the data sets, the theoretical papers, and we don't just summarize them.
No, not at
We
all.
extract the intellectual cohesion, what ties them all together. Today's deep dive is all about conquering what is, I think for many, the most demanding and often the most feared part of academic work.
The literature
The
review?
literature review. You've done the work, you've gone through thousands of abstracts, you've downloaded this core stack of PDFs, and you've highlighted them until they look like a highlighter just exploded on your desk.
It's all been there.
But then you stare at that blank page, and the challenge becomes, well, acute. The lit review is supposed to be this intellectual foundation for your own research. But for so many learners, it just devolves into this desperate cataloging of everything they read.
And that's the struggle, isn't it?
It is. The primary struggle we see, whether you're writing a dissertation or a major policy brief, is that learners confuse an analytical framework with a simple bibliography or, just a list of findings.
They feel they have to mention every single author.
Exactly. And that just gives you a disconnected narrative that completely fails to show any critical engagement.
And that failure of engagement is precisely why we're here. Our mission today is to give you the essential blueprint, a real structural and analytical guide that moves you from that fragmented summary to a strong, synthesized review.
Do I?
We're going to show you how to quickly see the underlying academic conversation happening in your sources, how to spot those core knowledge nuggets, and crucially, understand where that conversation is falling short.
That last part is so important.
It is, because remember, the power of a deep dive isn't just knowing what each author said, it's about seeing the pattern they all form together. It's using that pattern recognition to see the true state of the field.
That's the difference, right?
Yeah, that is the difference between just reporting on research and actually establishing yourself as an informed participant in that scholarly debate.
So we're going to cover 4 key areas today. First, the core mistake of just listing everything. Then we'll get into the mechanism for that intellectual cohesion synthesis by grouping things thematically.
Right.
After that, the 5-part macrostructure you need to build a really bulletproof argument. And finally, a simple 4-part paragraph formula you can use right away.
A practical tool.
Yes, very practical. And if you take away only one thing today, let it be this. Shift your focus completely. Stop talking about the individual sources you read and start talking about the interconnected ideas that those sources support.
That's the whole game.
All right, let's start by diagnosing the patient, which is often that first draft that lands on a supervisor's desk. The most common pitfall, the one that guarantees a disjointed paper, is that urge to summarize every single article you found.
One paragraph, one author.
One paragraph, one author, or even one sentence per author. You find 12 articles, you write 12 little summaries. You might even arrange them chronologically, thinking you're showing some kind of progression.
But you're not. What you end up with is an intellectual travelogue. It's a diary of what you read.
A diary, that's a great way to put it. It's not an analysis, and the draft feels fragmented. It's often super repetitive, and it just lacks the critical scaffolding that you need for advanced academic work.
It's a list. And a list, by its very definition, it fails to show your thinking analytically.
Right.
Let's make this really concrete with the researcher we've talked about before, Lean. She's tackling this really complex issue, the impact of social media on adolescent self-esteem. And she has 10 excellent sources. High-quality stuff.
Okay.
Surveys, interviews, even physiological studies. Now, Lean's first attempt, her unsynthesized approach, looks exactly like this. And I want you to listen carefully, because if this sounds familiar...
You're in the list trap.
You are in the list trap, she writes. Smith conducted a large survey and found a negative correlation between Instagram use and self-worth. Next, Johnson used qualitative interviews with teenagers and identified themes related to body dissatisfaction. Furthermore, Brown examined the effects of digital filters on mood.
I have read that paper 1,000 times.
We all have. The consequence of this A then B then C approach, is huge. Lean is moving from author to author, and her draft just loses all sense of flow. There's no unified argument.
No.
She's reported 10 separate facts, but she hasn't explained how any of those 10 facts relate to each other. Where's the overlap, the conflict, the shared assumptions? The reader is left to connect all the dots.
And that's the researcher's job, not the reader's.
That-
That's the real friction point, isn't it? When I read a draft like that, I'm sitting there thinking, okay, but is Johnson saying the same thing as Smith, just with a different method? Or are they actually disagreeing on why this has happened?
And if a writer doesn't tell you.
The review has failed. It's like having all the instruments in an orchestra play their part one by one instead of, harmonizing.
That analogy is perfect. It perfectly captures it. And the technique that solves this, that turns that noise into a clear analysis, is synthesis. And we really need to define this properly.
Okay, let's do it.
Synthesis is the intellectual heavyweight lifting. It's the process of critically evaluating and combining diverse ideas, findings, theories, all from multiple sources, sometimes sources that even seem to contradict each other.
Right.
And you combine them to create a unified, clear picture of what we know right now. And importantly, to draw new insights that you couldn't see by reading each source alone.
So it's more than the sum of its parts.
Much more. When you synthesize, your goal totally shifts. It's not about summarizing anymore, it's about finding relationships. You want to show where everyone agrees, the consensus. You want to show where the debates are, the contention.
The arguments.
The arguments. And you want to show how the ideas have evolved, how one study built on another. Only when you do that do you show you're actually fluent in the academic conversation on your topic.
You've moved from being a passive reporter
To an active analyst of the intellectual landscape.
which immediately tells the learner what they have to do practically.
Yeah,
You have to stop thinking of your sources as these separate little islands.
exactly.
The sources are your evidence, but the argument has to be built around the shared ideas or the themes that pop up when you look at them all together.
The moment you start grouping sources by what they say about a common theme, instead of who said it, that's when you start creating that intellectual cohesion.
It's a tough pivot to make.
It is, but it's the non-negotiable step toward writing a review that actually does its job.
So let's talk about the mechanics of that. For Lean, or for you, the learner, the challenge is getting from a huge pile of annotated files to a structured outline.
The jump from, say, 20 articles to 3 or 4 connected sections.
Right. How do you make that leap?
It happens on the second read-through, the analytical pass. The first pass is just for comprehension, understanding what's there. The second pass is all about pattern recognition.
Looking for the connections.
You're looking for recurring concepts, the big claims, the shared methods, the common effects being talked about, these recurring things. That's the raw material for your thematic buckets. Your whole outline changes.
So you're not writing summary of Jones, summary of Chen.
No. Your new outline has to read Theme A, causes of X, Theme B, psychological effects of X, and Theme C, proposed solutions for X. The authors disappear from the structure.
Let's go back to Lean and her research on social media and self-esteem and see what her successful second pass looked like. After she analyzed her 10 sources, she saw that it didn't matter if it was a quantitative study or qualitative interviews.
The authors were all circling the same few mechanisms of harm.
Exactly. So when Lean reorganized, she came up with 4 major thematic sections that covered all her research. First was comparison and unrealistic expectations.
So that's the bucket for everything about how we measure our lives against those curated Instagram feeds.
Right, social benchmarking. The second was validation and social approval. This was all the research on, the hunt for likes and comments and using that as a substitute for self-worth.
That behavioral loop.
The third theme was psychological effects of filters and digital manipulation.
Oh, that's a big one now. How filters and editing apps mess with our self-perception.
And her final theme was gender, culture, and demographic differences. This was for all the sources that showed how the impact varies, between genders or different cultures.
Look at the elegance of that structure. She's taken 10 complex arguments and boiled them down to 4 core mechanisms. She has defined the intellectual territory.
She's in control now.
She's in control of the narrative. She's not just following the publication dates or an alphabetical list of authors. She decides the flow of information for the reader.
And this is where the paragraph-level synthesis gets really interesting. We need to dissect a really successful synthesized paragraph. It can't start with an author's name.
No, it has to start with the theme and the claim. Then you bring in the authors as evidence.
Let's analyze the paragraph Lean wrote on the theme of comparison.
Okay, so she starts with a really clear thematic claim. A foundational consensus across the literature establishes that social media significantly increases the propensity for negative social comparison among young adults, which detrimentally affects self-esteem.
That's a strong start. It's a claim about the whole field, not one study.
Right. Then she brings in the evidence. She integrates the key finding from Smith, not his entire study. She writes, specifically, research by Smith, who surveyed 500 college students, highlights that users primarily compare their real-life circumstances to the highlight reels and idealized lifestyles presented by influencers.
Okay, so Smith provides the mechanism, comparison to influencers.
And then here's the synthesis move. She doesn't stop. She immediately brings in Johnson to show how his work supports or refines what Smith found.
No awkward transition.
No, it's seamless, it continues. Johnson supports and refines this argument, demonstrating a specific link between the consumption of highly aesthetic, photo-based platforms and an increased internalization of negative body image standards.
So Johnson's work validates Smith's point, but adds nuance. It narrows it down to the visual platform.
Precisely. And then, crucially, the paragraph ends with Lean's own analytical voice. The synthesis statement.
A conclusion?
She writes, taken together, these consistent empirical findings strongly suggest that social comparison is not just a secondary effect, but is indeed a primary psychological factor linking passive social media consumption to self-esteem erosion. And then she adds this killer final part. However, the exact nature of the relationship, specifically whether the platform causes the comparison or simply amplifies a pre-existing psychological trait, remains a source of academic friction.
Wait, I want to pause on that last sentence. That is absolutely critical.
It is.
You didn't just summarize their agreement. You immediately pointed out the next layer of complexity, the debate within the theme. You went from consensus to conflict in one breath.
That is the definition of analytical depth.
That's it.
The core rule is now established. Synthesis is using multiple sources, Smith, Johnson, maybe 3 others, to support, refine, or even complicate one central idea. You're the one weaving the tapestry. The authors are just the threads.
And once you master that thematic pivot, the literature review stops being a chore.
And it starts being the engine that powers the rest of your paper.
Okay, we've got the definition of synthesis and the power of the thematic paragraph. That's the micro level. Now let's scale up to the entire section. A great lit review has to guide the reader logically. It moves them from what's known to why your research is necessary.
And we're going to detail a definitive 5-part macro structure.
Think of this not as a suggestion, but as the blueprint for intellectual credibility.
This 5-part structure is designed to build momentum. It makes sure every word serves a strategic purpose, and it all leads to the justification for your own research question.
Okay, part 1.
Part 1 is the general overview. This is your hook and your scope. You have to start broad, but targeted. The opening does 3 things fast. It explains the topic, it defines the boundaries, and it justifies why it's important. Don't just jump into complex findings.
So for Lean's paper on self-esteem.
For Lean, the overview has to establish the stakes. It might start by defining self-esteem in the context of mental health and adolescent development, maybe with a striking statistic. For example, the exponential growth of social media platforms has created a novel and pervasive environment for identity formation, making the study of its influence on adolescent self-esteem a critical public health and psychological priority.
That sets the stage immediately. It tells the reader, this is important, this is established, and this has consequences. It's so often overlooked, but a strong opening just signals scholarly maturity.
It does. Then comes part 2. Introduce themes, not authors.
The organization.
This is the foundation we just talked about. Once the scene is set, you immediately lay out your thematic organization. But we need to talk about how you choose that organizing principle.
Because the choice itself is an analytical move.
Exactly. Organizing by, say, causes versus effects is standard. But a more sophisticated way is to organize by the history of the scholarship or by key methodological divides.
Can you give an example?
Sure. If you're studying climate policy, you could structure your review chronologically by generational theories. You know, the early focus was on mitigation, then it shifted to adaptation, and now it's all about equity.
So the structure tells a story of the field's evolution.
Or you could organize entirely by methodology. Imagine you're studying leadership styles. You could have one section on qualitative studies, interviews, and case studies, and the next on quantitative studies, survey data, and stats.
And that forces you to compare if the findings hold up across different research methods.
Precisely. That structural choice, which is guided by your source material, becomes part of your argument about the field's strengths and weaknesses.
That's a huge insight. If I organize by, say, physiological measures versus self-report measures, I'm inherently creating a tension that I have to resolve through synthesis. The structure is doing some of the analytical work for me.
Exactly. The structure becomes the critical scaffolding, which leads us to part 3. Compare and contrast studies.
The deep analysis.
This is where you show you're fluent. If you only summarize, you fail this step. Comparison and contrast mean you have to analyze the nuance, the consensus, and the conflict. This is the intellectual core of the whole thing.
So how do you do that?
You have to ask 4 key questions about every thematic group of sources. First, what's the established consensus? Where do they all agree?
The known territory.
You establish the known territory. For example, research across all domains consistently supports the conclusion that self-efficacy is a reliable predictor of academic success. You use multiple sources as undeniable proof.
Okay, second question.
Second, where is the intellectual friction? Where do they disagree? And more importantly, why? This is gold. Don't just say author A disagrees with author B. You have to unpack the source of the disagreement.
Is it about their core theories?
It could be a theoretical contradiction, yes, like a behaviorist versus a psychoanalytic approach. Or it could be about who they studied, population specificity. One studied urban, high-income subjects. The other studied rural, low-resource subjects.
So the findings don't actually conflict, they just apply to different groups.
Right. Or it could be a methodological inconsistency. Maybe one study couldn't be replicated because the original measurement wasn't actually measuring what it claimed to measure.
Lack of construct validity.
Exactly. Unpacking these technical reasons shows real critical depth.
I remember struggling with that so much. I was always scared to admit 2 major authors disagreed because I thought it meant I didn't understand the field.
But the friction is what makes the field interesting.
Right.
The complexity is the insight. Third question. Does one study refine or build upon another? This shows progression. So Smith's 2015 study established a correlation. Then Johnson's 2022 longitudinal study came along and established the direction of causality. Johnson didn't erase Smith. He refined the earlier observation.
You're telling the story of knowledge being built.
And fourth, are the findings robust across different methods? If 2 authors agree on an outcome, but one used ethnography and the other used fMRI scans, their agreement is incredibly powerful.
And if they disagree using the same method?
Then you've likely found a fundamental theoretical conflict, which is a perfect spot for future research. Analyzing your research through those 4 lenses, consensus, conflict, progression, and methodology, is what elevates you from listing to analyzing.
Okay, what's the 4th part of the blueprint?
Part 4. Highlight gaps or unanswered questions. This is the strategic pivot. After you've established what's known and where the friction is, you must clearly state what remains unknown, the gaps.
This is how you justify your own research.
It's a contract with your reader. If the existing literature is complete, your work is redundant. So defining the gap is the act of justifying your own investigation. And common gaps are more complex than just nobody studied this.
Right.
They can be empirical gaps, like no data on a specific population, or theoretical gaps, like a failure to connect competing models, or methodological gaps, like an over-reliance on self-report surveys.
It sounds like a strategic demolition. You spend the whole review building up the consensus,
Yes.
and then you point out the one crack in the foundation that only your research can fix.
Precisely. This step transforms the review from a summary into a critical analysis that proves the necessity of your paper.
And the final step.
Part 5. Connect the literature back to your research question. The pivot. The end of the literature review must be a seamless bridge to the rest of your paper. You use the gaps you just identified to justify your specific research question.
The reader should be nodding along thinking, yes, of course that study needs to be done next.
Exactly. Let's go back to Lean. After discussing her themes and highlighting the gap in cultural factors, her conclusion could be, while robust evidence exists on social media use in Western contexts, the literature suffers from a gap regarding how cultural expectations influence self-esteem outcomes. This failure leads directly to the central research question of this study.
And the necessity is now crystal clear.
Crystal clear.
That structure is incredibly powerful. It's the difference between saying, I read a lot of things, and saying, here's the critical foundation of the field, and here's the exact strategic point where I am moving that knowledge forward.
So we have the big picture.
We've covered the definition and the macro structure. We know the destination, but we need the tool to get there efficiently. We need that simple 4-part analytical checklist for actually drafting a synthesized body paragraph.
Right, the practical application.
This formula isn't about grammar. It's about making sure your paragraph hits all the right analytical marks. It guarantees you're synthesizing, not just summarizing. So here's the checklist.
Let's hear it.
1. A topic sentence introducing the theme in your claim. 2. Evidence from multiple sources. 3. Comparison, contrast, and nuance. And 4. A connection to your research or the next point in your review.
Anchor, proof, Analysis flow.
Exactly. Let's use a new research scenario to test it out, a classic university topic. How does regular physical exercise affect psychological stress in university students?
Oh, that's a great one. The research on that is massive, diverse, and often contradictory. It pulls from health science, sports psychology, neurobiology.
A perfect candidate for synthesis.
Absolutely. When a researcher starts categorizing their sources on this, they'll quickly find three core thematic areas. The first would be emotional effects, subjective well-being.
So self-reported data on mood and anxiety.
The second would be physiological effects. This is the hard data hormones like cortisol, neurotransmitters like serotonin.
Then a third.
Cognitive and behavioral effects. This is about mental processes focus, executive function, using exercise as a coping mechanism.
By using those three buckets, the writer avoids the trap of having one paragraph on Dr. Jones's cortisol study and the next on Dr. Chen's mood study.
Yes, they dedicate a full section to the physiological elements, and they weave Jones, Chen, and others together to build one unified argument about the body's response to stress.
Okay, let's draft a paragraph using the four-part formula. Let's target the theme of physiological effects.
Great. Step 1, the topic sentence. We introduce the theme and the consensus. Something like, the strongest and most replicated findings in stress literature center on the objective physiological mechanisms through which exercise mediates stress, primarily via hormonal regulation.
Strong claim. Now step 2, evidence from multiple sources.
We need to back it up. Several longitudinal studies tracking student cohorts over a full semester found that sustained physical activity decreases basal cortisol levels, the primary stress hormone. This finding is further supported by numerous meta-analyses.
I like that you specified meta-analyses. It adds so much weight.
It does. A meta-analysis shows it's not just one lab's result. It's the aggregated finding of dozens of studies. It's powerful evidence. So we continue, showing a highly significant and consistent increase in endorphin and serotonin production following exercise, which functions as a natural anxiolytic.
Okay, we've established the consensus. Now for step 3, comparison and nuance. The contrast.
This is where we introduce the complexity. We have to acknowledge that the benefit isn't unconditional. However, the magnitude of this physiological benefit is subject to debate regarding intensity. Some researchers argue that only high-intensity training produces the necessary hormonal cascade, while others caution that excessive high-intensity exercise may temporarily increase cortisol.
So you're not contradicting the core finding, you're refining it. You're showing the field is debating the how, not the what.
Precisely. The nuance is in the details of intensity and timing. And finally, step 4, connection to the next point. We wrap this up and bridge to the next theme. These objective findings underscore the role of exercise in modulating biological stress. However, the literature is still seeking to clarify how these physiological changes translate into subjective self-reported improvements in mood, leading us now to a discussion of the observed emotional effects.
Perfect flow. Now let's try something harder. Let's use the formula for a paragraph where the sources actually disagree, where the intellectual friction is high.
A great challenge. Let's take the cognitive and behavioral effects theme. And let's imagine there's a sharp disagreement about whether exercise helps with cognitive performance under deadline pressure.
Okay.
Step 1, topic sentence. We introduce the conflict right away. While exercise is often championed as a critical coping strategy, the literature presents a sharp methodological divide regarding its efficacy in improving cognitive performance under high-stakes academic stress.
Okay, the battle lines are drawn. Step 2, evidence for both sides.
We establish the two opposing camps. One body of research, heavily relying on cross-sectional surveys, robustly claims that students who exercise daily report significantly higher concentration scores. Conversely, a smaller but methodologically rigorous group of laboratory studies failed to detect any statistically significant difference in memory recall or problem solving.
That's excellent. You've established the disagreement and immediately hinted at the reason for it. Subjective survey data versus objective lab data.
Which brings us right to step 3. Analyze the conflict. This clear contradiction is likely rooted in differences in measurement. The survey-based findings may suffer from self-report bias, where students believe they are concentrating better. The objective lab studies, however, may fail to capture the real-world long-term cumulative benefits.
So you're not taking sides. You're analyzing the limitations of both positions. That's deep analysis.
It's explaining why the contradiction exists. And finally, step 4, connection to your research. Therefore, the evidence suggests exercise provides a powerful perceived cognitive benefit, but its role as a direct enhancer of cognitive function remains ambiguous. This gap highlights the necessity of our study, which integrates both self-report and objective measures to reconcile this fundamental disagreement.
That one paragraph is a deep dive all by itself. It's analyzing, contrasting, and advancing the conversation. And it directly justifies your own research. So let's think about Lean one last time. By applying this checklist to her themes, comparison, validation, filters, and gender, she turned her 10 isolated summaries into 4 strong, connected paragraphs.
She proved that the literature review isn't about what you read.
It's about what you made out of what you read. That is the true power of synthesis.
So as we wrap up today's deep dive, let's just reinforce that shift in mindset. If you implement these 4 pillars, your literature review will stop feeling like a burden.
And it'll start being the intellectual engine of your work.
First, your fundamental principle has to be organize sources into themes. Focus on the ideas, not the authors.
That defines the conversation.
Second, you must aggressively compare and contrast findings. Look beyond simple agreement or disagreement. Dig into the source of the friction. Is it methods, populations, or theory? Third, always analyze and provide that critical scaffolding. Don't just report. Use the sources as evidence for your thematic claims. Always highlight the complexity, the nuance.
And finally,
Your analysis must create an undeniable foundation for your own argument. You do that by explicitly calling out the gaps, theoretical, empirical, or methodological, that your research is going to fill.
synthesis, when you boil it all down, is the shortcut to being truly well-informed. It saves you time not because you read less, but because you read smarter.
Exactly.
You move right past the isolated facts to the interconnected web of knowledge. When you synthesize, you're not just listing facts. You're building knowledge and identifying exactly where the next big breakthrough needs to happen.
And that strategic identification of gaps leads directly to our final provocative thought for you, the learner. We've established that the whole purpose of this review is to define the boundaries of knowledge and find the gaps. Now, as you prepare to move from the review to the main body of your paper, ask yourself this question.
Okay.
How will the specific analytical gaps you highlighted in your literature review, be they theoretical conflicts, a lack of certain data, issues of validity, how will those gaps fundamentally dictate your choice of methodology, your ethical considerations, the structure of your arguments in the discussion section, and the recommendations you make in your conclusion?
Wow.
The degree to which you can trace a direct line from those gaps to the structure of your subsequent chapters will determine the ultimate intellectual integrity and the success of your entire project.
Until then, happy synthesizing. We'll talk to you next time on The Deep Dive.